She left a birthday party at midnight. 1 mile of trail stood between her and home, a trail she had walked hundreds of times in a town so small that locking your front door felt almost insulting to your neighbors. She never made it, and for the next 24 years, the man who killed her breathed free air, lived a quiet life, moved across the country, and probably assumed he had gotten away with it forever. He almost did. This is the story of how a 17-year-old girl's murder in a tiny Alaskan fishing town went unsolved for nearly a quarter century. How one man falsely confessed and nearly went to prison for it. How investigators compared DNA to more than 100 different people and got nothing but dead ends. And how, in the end, it wasn't a witness or a tip or a confession that broke the case open. It was a family tree built from the DNA of strangers who had never heard of Sitka, Alaska, in their lives. And when investigators finally knocked on the right door, what happened in the 30 minutes that followed answered every question they had without a single word being spoken. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this are what you came here for, hit that subscribe button. We tell these kinds of stories every week. To understand why this case shook people so deeply, you have to understand Sitka. Sitka, Alaska sits on the western edge of Baranof Island, wrapped in the ancient green of the Tongass National Forest, and surrounded by Pacific Ocean on nearly every side. In 1996, about 8,000 people called it home. There was a harbor, there were fishing boats, there were trails through the spruce and hemlock that locals had walked since childhood without a second thought about safety. Because in Sitka, you knew everyone, and everyone knew you. Violent crime wasn't just rare, it was practically foreign to the culture of the place. Jessica Baggin had grown up in all of it. She knew Sitka's roads the way you know the layout of your own house, without thinking, without looking. Her friends and family remembered her as someone who carried herself with the easy confidence of a person who felt genuinely at home in her world. She loved fishing. She loved cooking. She was by every account exactly the kind of person that a small harbor town produces, grounded, independent, deeply connected to where she came from. On the night of May 3, 1996, Jessica turned 17 years old. She celebrated the way most teenagers in small towns celebrate, at a gathering with family and friends, at her sister's house, nothing particularly extraordinary about it. No reason for anyone in that room to feel uneasy when she decided, sometime after midnight, to head home on her own. The distance was roughly a mile. The bike trail through the woods near Sheldon Jackson College campus on Sawmill Creek Road was as familiar to her as her own backyard. Nobody worried. That was the nature of Sitka. Jessica Baggin walked onto that trail after midnight on her 17th birthday. She never walked off the other side. When Jessica's parents woke up the next morning and found her bed empty, they told themselves there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe she had stayed at her sister's place after the party ran late. These things happen. But as the hours passed with no phone call, no message, no word from anyone in her circle confirming she was safe, the reasonable explanations ran out. Her father drove to the Sitka Police Department in the early hours of May 5th and reported his daughter missing. He returned again that evening to confirm that nothing had changed, no contact, no sighting, no sign of Jessica anywhere. Search and rescue teams moved into the woods west of the Indian River, focusing on the stretch of trail between the college campus and Sawmill Creek Road. That corridor of the Tongass Forest, dark beneath the canopy even in daylight, silent except for the wind moving through the trees, was where Jessica had been headed. On May 6, 1996, 2 days after she disappeared, searchers found the shirt she had been wearing the night of her birthday, lying in the woods close to the trail. Less than 2 hours after that, they found Jessica. She had been buried in a shallow grave dug beneath a fallen tree. Her other clothing and belongings were scattered across the surrounding area. The autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. Jessica had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. She was 17 years old. She had just celebrated her birthday. The medical examiner's report included one additional detail that would haunt investigators for decades. There was a wound on Jessica's back that no one could explain. It didn't match any known weapon or tool. It didn't appear in any forensic database. One investigator, a man named Hunor, who would later take the lead on the case, kept a photograph of that wound on his office door for years. He would ask every colleague and detective who came into his office if they had any idea what could have caused it. No one ever did. It was the question that never got answered, one of many in a case that seemed designed to resist resolution. 9 days after Jessica's body was discovered, a man named Richard Bingham walked into the Sitka Police Department and told investigators that he had killed her. Bingham had a severe alcohol dependency. He experienced complete memory blackouts when he drank heavily, the kind where hours or even entire nights simply ceased to exist in his recollection. When detectives reviewed the interrogation footage, something became immediately clear. Bingham wasn't recounting a memory. He was recounting a story, one assembled from fragments he had heard or read, shaped by a brain that had filled in the gaps with borrowed details and convinced itself they were real. He had none of the specific, unprompted knowledge that only someone who had actually committed the crime would carry. No detail that had never been made public. No information that couldn't have come from someone who had simply followed the news. And yet, there were things that gave investigators pause, details that weren't widely known, facts about the scene and the way the body had been concealed that weren't in any public report that Bingham somehow had access to. His boat, when searched, turned up materials that added an uncomfortable layer of context to the overall picture, even if nothing found was direct evidence of guilt. Then the DNA results arrived. The biological evidence collected from Jessica's body and clothing was compared to Richard Bingham's profile. No match. The man confessing to killing Jessica Bagan was not her killer. Science had confirmed it. And yet, as investigator Dave Tugman later explained, the decision to bring the case to trial was not without logic. Too many coincidences. Too many things that didn't add up cleanly in either direction. In 1997, with the investigative tools available at the time, and with a jury ultimately responsible for deciding what the evidence meant, the prosecution moved forward. The jury acquitted Bingham on all charges. A man who didn't commit the murder avoided a wrongful conviction. Justice, in that narrow sense, was served. But Jessica's actual killer was still out there, and now the investigation had to start over. The years that followed were defined by persistence in the face of repeated failure. The Alaska State Troopers and Sitka Police Department continued building their suspect list and continued comparing DNA samples to the profile recovered from the 1996 scene. One person after another was tested and cleared, then another, then another. Over the course of more than 2 decades, investigators would run that comparison more than 100 times. 100 moments where someone thought, this could be the one. 100 results that came back saying, no. Jessica's father refused to step back and wait for bureaucratic timelines to determine who got tested and when. He paid out of his own pocket for DNA testing for anyone willing to voluntarily provide a sample. Dave Tugman, who had been lead investigator from the early years, later spoke about Jessica's father with a kind of quiet admiration. A man who had no legal authority, no investigative resources, and no ability to compel anyone to cooperate, but who did everything a father could possibly do to find the person who had taken his daughter. Dave Tugman eventually handed the lead investigator role to Hunor, who carried his own version of the weight that the Bagan case placed on everyone who touched it. When Randy McFerrin, a retired detective, was brought on in 2013 by the Cold Case Investigation Unit, he understood that the raw material needed to solve the case was already in the lab. The DNA was there. What was missing wasn't a new clue. It was a new way of using the clue they already had. While all of this was happening, the testing, the dead ends, the years turning into decades, a man named Steve Allen Branch was living in Sitka. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't invisible. He had, in fact, already come to the attention of the Sitka Police Department in 1996, just weeks before Jessica Bagan was killed. In March of that year, Branch had been investigated for the sexual assault of a teenage girl who had been out jogging alone on a road in Sitka. Same city, same year, a lone young woman outdoors in a place where no one thought this kind of thing could happen. Branch was charged and arrested for that assault in June 1996, 1 month after Jessica's murder. His trial took place in 1997, the same year Richard Bingham stood trial for Jessica's death. The verdicts, in a grim parallel, were identical. Both men were acquitted. Branch continued to live in Sitka for more than a decade after that. In a town of 8,000 people, he was simply there. His name never surfaced in connection with the Bagan case during those years because, at the time, nothing in the active investigation pointed toward him. The 1996 sexual assault investigation and the murder case existed in separate tracks that never intersected. In 2010, Branch left Alaska entirely and relocated to Austin, Arkansas, thousands of miles from the Tongass Forest, from Sawmill Creek Road, from the trail where he had buried a 17-year-old girl on her birthday. In September 2018, The Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Investigation Unit began exploring a forensic method that had only recently become viable for criminal investigations: genetic genealogy. The concept was both elegant and profound in its implications. Millions of Americans had voluntarily submitted their DNA to public genealogy databases, sites like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, not because they were connected to any crime, but because they wanted to know where they came from: ancestry, heritage, family origins. The database was built entirely out of curiosity, out of the very human desire to understand your own history. But those DNA profiles could also serve another purpose. If an unknown suspect's DNA was detailed enough, it could be compared against those databases to find partial matches, not the suspect themselves, necessarily, but distant relatives. Second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough genetic material with the suspect that a sufficiently detailed family tree, built carefully and patiently in reverse, could eventually point toward a single individual. The Alaska State Crime Lab confirmed that the DNA preserved from the 1996 evidence was sufficient to generate an SNP profile, a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, detailed enough to use in this new kind of search. In February 2019, that profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database. 2 genetic genealogists went to work. What they built over the following months was, in investigator McFerrin's words, a very complex family tree. They started from distant relatives in the database, people who shared fragments of DNA with the unknown suspect without any awareness of their connection to a 1996 murder in Alaska, and worked their way backward through generations, narrowing branches, eliminating possibilities, following the genetic trail wherever it led. It led directly to Steve Allen Branch, the man who had been investigated in Sitka in 1996, the man who had been acquitted of sexual assault in 1997, the man who had moved to Arkansas in 2010 and had been living there, quietly, for a decade. In January 2020, the Cold Case Investigation Unit reached out to the Arkansas State Police for help obtaining a discarded DNA sample from Branch, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, anything he had touched and left behind that could be collected without his knowledge or cooperation. For weeks, those efforts produced nothing. Investigators approached the problem from another direction. In the spring of 2020, a DNA sample was obtained from one of Branch's relatives. The kinship analysis that followed, comparing that relative's DNA to the suspect profile from 1996, was completed in May 2020. The conclusion was unambiguous. Steve Allen Branch was highly likely to be the source of the DNA collected from Jessica Baggins' body and clothing 24 years earlier. On August 3, 2020, investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation drove to Branch's home in Austin, Arkansas. They sat across from the 66-year-old man and laid out exactly what they had: the genealogy profile, the kinship analysis, the family tree built by 2 experts whose methodology had already been validated in other cold cases across the country. Everything pointed to him. Branch denied it, all of it. He denied knowing Jessica. He denied being anywhere near the trail on the night of May 3, 1996. He refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample, the one thing that could have resolved the question definitively in either direction. Investigators left his home to pursue an arrest warrant and a court order for compelled DNA collection through the appropriate legal process. 30 minutes later, Steve Allen Branch shot himself. Arkansas authorities ruled the death a suicide. No statement was ever made, no confession was given. But the act itself, 30 minutes after investigators walked out the door, communicated something that no jury would ever need to weigh. The warrant was executed during Branch's autopsy. His DNA was collected and compared to the profile that had been sitting in the Alaska State Crime Lab since 1996, compared to more than 100 people and found to match none of them. On August 10, 2020, the results came back. Complete match. On August 11, 2020, Alaska Department of Public Safety Commissioner Amanda Price stood before cameras and said what Jessica's family had been waiting 24 years to hear: the case was solved. Jessica Baggins' killer had been identified. The Baggin case is not just a story about crime and investigation. It is a story about 3 things that matter far beyond the specifics of this case. The first is biological evidence and why it must be preserved. The DNA collected in May 1996 from Jessica's body and clothing, gathered by investigators who had no idea that genetic genealogy would one day exist, who had no reason to believe the world of forensic science would transform so dramatically in the decades ahead, was the entire foundation of the 2020 breakthrough. Without it, nothing that followed would have been possible. Genetic genealogy is only as powerful as the DNA it starts with. Evidence does not have an expiration date if it is properly preserved, and no one in 1996 could have predicted what that evidence would eventually make possible. The second is something the public may not fully appreciate about consumer DNA databases. If you have submitted your genetic profile to a genealogy service, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, GDmatch, Family Tree DNA, that profile can, under certain legal and investigative frameworks, be used in forensic investigations. Not because you are suspected of anything, but because you may share a distant genetic connection with someone who is. You become unknowingly a node in a family tree that investigators might one day build in reverse. This raises genuine questions about privacy, about consent, about the long-term implications of voluntary data sharing, and those are questions worth sitting with, regardless of where you land on them. The third is the most human of the three: persistence. This case was solved because people refused to let it become a cold statistic. Dave Tugman worked it in the early years. Hunter kept the photo of that unexplained wound on his office door and kept asking questions. Randy McFerrin joined the Cold Case Investigation Unit in 2013 and identified the bag and file as a priority, understanding that what was needed wasn't new evidence, but new technology applied to old evidence. And Jessica's father, a man with no badge, no authority, no access to forensic labs, spent his own money, year after year, funding DNA tests for anyone willing to submit a sample, because he couldn't sit still and wait for a system with limited resources to determine his daughter's case was worth prioritizing. 24 years, more than 100 dead ends, multiple generations of investigators, one father who never stopped, and a family tree built from the DNA of strangers. That is what it took to answer the question that the Tongass Forest refused to answer on its own. Who killed Jessica Baggin on the night of her 17th birthday? His name was Steve Allen Branch. He never answered for it in a courtroom. But science, and the people who refused to give up, answered for him. If you watched this far, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. We're here every week.